Hello, class. I'd like to welcome you to the final podcast of this course. It's been a pleasure being with you this semester, and I hope you feel like you've learned some new things about the world that we live in. This podcast is going to explore human evolution and also take a look at some of the common criticisms of the theory of evolution. I would also like to encourage you to watch the podcast on Does Evolution Matter Now? And as that explores the process of antibiotic resistance. I think it does a very good job of that, and I think you'll enjoy that video. So let's get started with our final podcast for the semester. So when we think about human evolution, one of the common questions that comes up is, did humans evolve from chimpanzees? And to address this, let's consider this idea that chimpanzees are our closest living relative. Okay, so if we look at a tree of the primates here we have the chimpanzees, here we have us. Realize that we are not descendants from chimpanzees, but what we are saying is that we share a common ancestor. So this represents that last common ancestor that was shared by humans and chimpanzees. So, and we could look even further back. Here would be the last common ancestor that humans shared with gorillas. Here would be where that last common ancestor was that we shared with the orangutans, and so forth and so on. And the key thing to keep in mind with this is that we wouldn't say that we are descendants of chimpanzees, but again, they are our closest living relative, just like you wouldn't say, most cases, that you are a descendant of your cousin. Okay? That you share, what we would say is that you share a common ancestor with your cousin, which would typically be your grandparents. Okay? Generally, within our culture, we don't approve of having your cousin be your parent. So think about that for a minute. And now let's move on here. So as we consider this situation, the question becomes, well, if humans and chimpanzees shared a common ancestor, well, a couple of questions. What drove our ancestors apart from those of chimpanzees, and why are there still chimpanzees? Well, let's consider this here, okay? What we want to think about is our ancestors, common ancestors with the chimpanzees, lived in a fairly large range in Africa. Where our ancestors lived, that region was affected, as naturally happens in our over the course of history, by climate change. And in fact, it was a cooling climate that occurred. And this cooling climate where our ancestors lived, this was about 5 to 10 million years ago, shifted that environment from being forested, where the chimpanzees currently live now, to an area that is more of a savanna to open woodland. So picture how you typically think of Africa now on the Serengeti or such, where you've got a tree here, a tree over there, with lots of grasslands. That's where our ancestors ended up. And so there are very different selection pressures on our ancestors compared to the selection pressures placed on the chimpanzees, which still lived in the woods. So our ancestors, as you're out in a grassy area, one of the things to do is, as you're moving from one tree to the other, you might need to stand up to see over the grass so that you can see if there are predators coming. And as such, we were able to see that, and as you stood up, it freed your hands. So now you might be able to carry a stick so that you could throw it at a predator or shake it at a predator to scare them off. You might be able to carry some food with you as you're leaving a tree, or carry a baby. So this was proved to be very beneficial for our ancestors, this being bipedal in this more open environment. Whereas chimpanzees, they stayed in the forest, and they're very well adapted to living in that environment. So there really wasn't a need for them to change. Chimpanzees live just fine in the forest. So there wasn't that selection for them to change to be bipedal and so forth. So one of the key things when we think about our lineage is this bipedalism, being able to walk. The first genus or group of organisms that were bipedal were called belonged to the genus Australopithecus. We belong to the genus Homo. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. These individuals that were living out on that savanna were about a yard tall, so a meter tall. So picture a yard, probably a little bit above your hip, probably. And they were indeed walking on 2 feet. We have a really wonderful fossil remains here. This is volcanic ash. And so as that volcanic ash was falling, you had early individual, an adult, with a child walking as their environment was absolutely devastated by this volcanic eruption. Imagine if you were to wake up, you have a rumbling off in the distance, the sky would darken with ash, and it would become very difficult to breathe. The ground would be entirely covered with this ash, and the environment would be desolated due to this event. And so here you have perhaps a parent and a child, perhaps the last surviving members of their group, walking in this devastated environment. This is a snapshot in the history of life of these two individual struggles that they were going through. The rest of this story is lost to time as to what happened to these individuals. But what we can see from this is that they were indeed bipedal, walking on 2 feet. And again, that's what separated our lineage from that of the chimpanzees. Now, if we're to take a look at these individuals, so here's a chimpanzee, here's Australopithecus, and you can see that, maybe a slightly larger brain case than that of the apes, but it really wasn't that big of a difference at this point, right? And again, the brains were much smaller than what we enjoy today. So, as mentioned before, really the key step in our lineage is this idea of bipedalism. Bipedalism means walking on 2 legs, so that was really the key thing. And as we look at the evolution of humans, we typically view it as this progression to modern humans. We go from this ape, chimpanzee-like organism to us today. What I want you to realize is that in the true evolution of humans, this is not how it worked. It was not just a linear progression to us. That our family tree is not a straight line to us, but it's a shrub. It's a bush, if you will. And we are the last surviving branch on that tree. Here is a look at the evolution, the family tree of bipedalism. This is our family tree. Here we are the last surviving branch of this tree. Here we go, here's the first Australopithecines, and we see that early on there's a branch here that produces some of these Australopithecines, Australopithecus robustus, Australopithecus boisei. We'll talk about them as well, but there are other species. And you'll notice that the line goes on and then it cuts out because that species went extinct. And new species arose that were able to replace the ones that were previously present. And then here's our side of things. We've got Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, and then we move on, Neanderthalensis. Here we are, Homo sapiens up here. So all the rest of these lineages went extinct. We are simply the last surviving lineage of these bipedal individuals that started off with those early Australopithecines. Now, let's take a step back here. We see this branch over here. What's up with these guys? Australopithecus robustus and boisei. I want to talk about these guys because they're pretty amazing. They lived in Africa, which actually early on at this time, all these individuals were living in Africa. We are indeed the descendants of, we're all ultimately coming out of Africa as humans. And